Don't worry, Frank. I'll have you extradited back to the United States. Don't worry.
Frank quickly burned through the massive fortune he'd conned his way into, and he was already searching for his next identity. At a hospital, he met a young nurse. Seeing that she was upset, he immediately tried to comfort her. The girl touched his heart, and he decided this time he'd pose as a doctor. He forged a medical degree, and when the hospital saw he was supposedly a top graduate with years of experience, they hired him on the spot. He became head physician, which brought him closer to the girl. Just as things were getting serious between them, an emergency case came in, a boy with a broken leg. Frank took one look, grabbed some sterilized cotton to cover his nose and mouth, and fought back the urge to vomit. He made an excuse to leave and bolted to the bathroom, where he threw up uncontrollably. The girl invited Frank to dinner at her house. Her father was a prominent lawyer, and when Frank mentioned wanting to return to the legal profession, her father found it odd and called him into a private room to ask what he really did for a living. Frank quickly put on an act, and his love for the man's daughter moved the father so much that he brought Frank on as a lawyer. Frank's career took off like a rocket. In just 2 months, he became an assistant district attorney. He and the girl were even planning to get married, but on their wedding day, Carl showed up. Frank rushed into a room, grabbed all his savings and stuffed them into a suitcase. There was no time to explain to the girl. He snatched the case and jumped out the window. The girl had no idea what was happening and cried her heart out. By the time the police arrived, Frank was long gone. Frank arranged to meet his wife at the airport, but he sensed he was surrounded by plainclothes officers. He contacted a local university and once again claimed to be a pilot, giving a lecture to students. He picked 8 of the most beautiful girls, and the group appeared at the airport with Frank at the center. The police were distracted by the spectacle, and Frank brazenly boarded his plane right under their noses. He became even more reckless with his check counterfeiting, even opening a factory. 7 months later, Carl tracked down Frank's operation. Frank grabbed his checks and tried to run, but Carl told him the place was surrounded by police. If he went outside, he'd be shot on sight. The only safe option was to go with Carl. Frank voluntarily put on handcuffs, and Carl escorted him outside. There were no police there, and just as Frank thought he'd been tricked, squad cars immediately pulled up and shoved him inside. A year later, Frank was finally brought back to the country. On the plane, he asked if he could see his father before serving his sentence, but Carl told him his father had passed away. Frank broke down crying and rushed into the bathroom. When he didn't come out for a long time, Carl kicked down the door and found it empty. Frank had escaped home, only to discover his mother had started a new family. When the police arrived, Frank walked to the squad car on his own. 6 months later, Carl visited him in prison and brought along a counterfeit check. Frank immediately identified the forger as a bank teller. Carl brought Frank along to help police solve cases, and Frank earned parole. Carl invited Frank to work for him. Every day, Frank faced stacks of paperwork and felt hopeless. One weekend, he put on his uniform again, planning to fly abroad. Carl didn't try to stop him. Sure enough, Frank returned to work on Monday. He knew that only with Carl could his life have real meaning.